Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World. Still not fully back to health at this point, but getting there, and I think I can probably do something a little bit lengthier than last time, not sure. Anyway, my topic for today is why I became a pastor. And it's a long story, so I think I'm going to break it into two parts. And it's the answer to a very general question that many of my university students used to ask me in some form or another. They were usually a little bit shy about it, but they'd say, well, Professor, you're an anthropologist and you're also an ordained minister. How do you reconcile the two? And that was actually a very revealing question, that they thought that somehow or other, to be an anthropologist, you had to be some version of atheist. And actually that's reasonably true. I think most anthropologists are, let's say, agnostic. I don't know about atheist, and we can get into that a little bit. But a lot of the problems arise from the discord between, let's say, human evolution and the first chapter of Genesis. Did we get here by creation or by biology? Well, what most of my students didn't understand was that that's not a real conflict in intellectual circles, that you can be a Christian and not believe the creation story. And in fact, there was a lot of things they didn't understand about being a Christian and being a pastor. So what I'd like to do in this, let's call it a series, it may not be more than two, what I'd like to do is to begin by exploring how I became a pastor, how I made the decision to become a pastor, which is a long and complicated road. And then once I had made the decision, what I had to do in order to become ordained, and how I could manage to satisfy myself and also all of the ministers and elders in my presbytery that I was somehow or other a genuine pastor and not just some kind of wolf in sheep's clothing. So let's get into that. So the best place to start would be why I decided to study theology at university. I had the intention of studying at Oxford if I could, and there were many different options, but theology seemed like a reasonable option because by about my upper sixth year, lower sixth maybe, certainly the sixth form, I was beginning to think in terms of the church as a profession. And it's a very long process, typically taking a first bachelor's degree and then going to seminary and taking a second degree and then doing the various examinations and so forth from there. But in the Anglican tradition, it's possible to do a first degree in theology and then go to seminary. And that's kind of where I was heading. And so I put my sights towards that. And I won't go into all of the examination process, a very, very difficult road. But I got accepted by Pembroke College at Oxford in 1969 and attended as what's called a commoner. That is, I didn't have one of their fancy scholarships. But I had two other students at my college who were also studying theology, and I began to realize really, really early on that theology was nothing like what I had imagined when I went to church. When I went to church, in England, when I was living in England, when I studied for Oxford, I was singing bass in the choir. So I was, considered to be, somebody active in the church, and so I went every single Sunday, and I also went to choir practice on Friday night. I listened to every sermon, and got confirmed within the church. And so I thought that I knew something about Christianity. And the fact of the matter is, I knew nothing about Christianity. Nothing. And the reason is twofold. One of them is that if you're an average congregant, pew sitter in a church, you hear very little of the Bible. You hear stock parts of the Bible that are repeated over and over again. Sometimes they use what's called a lectionary, which means that you kind of proceed through the Bible in a 3-year cycle. But you don't read every word. They pick out passages, and they become the passage to read, and then for the pastor to write a sermon about. And so in the course of 3 years, I can't do the actual mathematics in my head, but I imagine that the average pew sitter, if they sit through 3 years of readings, will probably know about 1% of the Bible, and that's it. And the sermons are mostly homiletic. They're mostly telling you, look, this passage teaches you how to live a good life. The end. And so you end up knowing absolutely nothing about the Bible and absolutely nothing about Christian theology. So when I got to Oxford, I had a gigantic shock. So at Oxford I came up against two major problems. One of them being that I knew nothing about the Bible whatsoever, and the second being that I was thrown into the middle of what was at the time a new form of theology within Anglican traditions, at least, which they generally call liberal theology. That is where you interpret the Bible according to standard literary and historical norms, rather than considering it to be some kind of divine truth. And I was just not I was not equipped at all. It hadn't occurred to me, although I was very strongly interested in history in the second form, and so the historical parts of the Bible that I studied did seem amenable to standard historical methods, and I was kind of okay there. So my first term at Oxford, we studied what's called a succession narrative, which is the tail end of the second book of Samuel and the beginning of the first book of Kings. And it's all about how David attained the throne of the united monarchy, and then how one after another of his sons became unworthy / dead, and Solomon, the youngest son inherited. Now, since that time, we're talking about 50 years ago, an awful lot has been done since then, and now that narrative is not even considered to be genuine history. Archaeology demonstrates that the United Monarchy just never did exist. But anyway, that part was okay with me. I had to write an essay for my tutor once a week, and we talked about kingship and ritual and temple worship and so forth, and yeah, it's kind of interesting to me. That was the first term, and I had exams at the end of the second term, and there were going to be 3 papers, 2 of them mandatory and 1 of them a choice. The 2 mandatory ones were the succession narrative from the Bible and doctrines of the creed, and then you could pick Hebrew translation, Greek translation, or moral philosophy. And I knew enough Greek that I didn't want to start that again, so I began Hebrew. So I took the 3 papers were the succession narrative, the doctrines of the creed, and beginning Hebrew. All seemed fine until I got into doctrines of the creed. And the thing is that within the Presbyterian tradition, creeds are really quite secondary and are often frowned upon as being somehow or other like manufactured, or your factory belief. Like believe this, and I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and his only Son Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the Virgin Mary, and blah 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 blah. And Presbyterians just don't like reciting creeds, or at least in England at the time they didn't. In the United States, they're a little bit happier with it. But I had to write 8 essays on the doctrines of the creed, and I had never come across anything remotely like Anglican doctrine, ever. So here I am having to somehow justify the virgin birth and the Trinity and on, and I was just completely lost, because it was a kind of way of thinking that was so alien to me. I mean, if I had known a little bit about philosophy at that time, I think I might have grasped it better, and if my tutor had approached it more philosophically, then maybe we could have got on a little better. But I had no idea. And then I came across a passage in one of the texts that I had to read, which said, we can be, I'm paraphrasing obviously, we can be indulgent towards congregants who believe in miracles. And I said, what? I believe in miracles. I believe Jesus turned water into wine. I believed he raised Lazarus from the dead. I believe he cured the leper. And this priest is saying, we use the miracles as a way of kind of helping people to understand some of the mysteries of the church, but it's okay. Just like keep cool about it. And around that time, I just, that light bulb moment. It's like, I'm not on board with any of this at all. I don't know what anything is about. And I passed my prelims fine. At least I knew enough, I had enough sense to pass the the exams, giving the examiners what they wanted. Like the history paper was no problem. And the doctrines of the creed, I just remembered stock stuff and put it down. And of course, the Hebrew was just translation. There's no problem. And then I started my third term, which is when we began the proper study of the Bible, and we had to spend 2 years studying the Hebrew and the Greek sections of the Bible. And as we started doing that, I just slid off a cliff. It's just like I have no relationship to this way of thinking about the Bible whatsoever. And so certainly by the early parts of my second year, I was effectively what people would call an atheist now. I don't mean that I didn't believe in God, but that I didn't believe in the God that was being touted by the powers that be within Oxford University. And so I just went through the motions for 3 years, got my degree, and was about to leave when I decided to go and visit the master of Mansfield College. And Mansfield College was the seminary for what had become the United Reformed Church. Originally there'd been the Presbyterian Church on the one hand and the Congregational Church on the other hand, but they were losing members and closing churches left, right, and center. And so they decided to amalgamate and become the United Reformed Church. Well, Mansfield College had originally been the Congregationalist seminary, but because it was united with the Presbyterian Church, it was now open to people like me who could become seminarians for the United Reformed Church. So I went and visited George Caird and I said, I would like to consider extending my studies. And the reason I was thinking of doing that was because my other choice was going into teaching, and I was just vacillating. So I thought, well, I'll go to him. I had no intention of pursuing ordination in the long run, but I thought, well, for a year or two, I could kind of, mark time and then see where things go. And I also applied to do an education certificate. So I had two options, and as it happens, in my hometown, a school offered me a job teaching, and in those days you didn't need a certificate to teach if you had a university degree. So I just went and taught technical drawing and mathematics. That was my first teaching job. And from there, the path towards ordination gets very, very curvy and narrow. Now, a little bit more information. Starting before I went to Oxford, I had been involved in traditional English dancing, Morris dancing, sword dancing, country dancing, all kinds of types of dancing. And when I got to Oxford, I was part of a group of dancers who performed not just in Oxford, but also in counties around England in the summers. And several of the members also did research on the dances. And because my studies of theology were not in the least interesting to me, I spent a lot of time researching the dances too. Oxford has a library called the Bodleian Library, which is a copyright deposit library, meaning that every book, article, magazine, whatever that is copyrighted in England must be deposited in the Bodleian. And I remember distinctly, I was in my third year, and I remember distinctly going over my notes for an essay or some such, and having this bing and realizing every book on these dances that's ever been published in England is in this library. And I went to the index and I started a flurry of activity, and I eventually got to the point where I was finding old manuscripts and all manner of stuff, and I was busily copying down notes and so forth for 2 years. And I did much more work on dance ever that I did on my theological studies. And through a complicated process, I ended up at the University of North Carolina studying folklore, where I turned my notes on the dance into a thesis on the dance in Europe, and also the dance as it had migrated via Dominican monks to the Spanish colonies in South America and certain small parts of the United States, and which is eventually published as a book. And in the process of doing my degree in folklore, I had to take some cultural anthropology courses. And after the first year, I decided that anthropology is pretty cool. And I couldn't do a PhD in folklore at the University of North Carolina, but I could do a PhD in anthropology. And to some extent, I could use my interest in dance and music and so forth in my PhD. And so I moved in that direction. And my dissertation advisor was very interested in the anthropology of religion. And so I also got myself involved in the anthropology of religion. Why do people believe the things that they believe? Why do they do the things that they do? And so on. And it's got a long history in social and cultural anthropology, stretching back into the 19th century. So that became my specialty. I had twin specialties. One was aesthetics and one was religion, and you combine them together, like the aesthetics of religion, like religious music and rhetoric and poetry and what have you. And so I was, on a nice path. At the time, thinking that not believing in the Christian doctrine was the best way to study Christians. If you go and do field work at a church service, you can perhaps get closer to understanding why people do what they do. And I did my doctoral dissertation in a small fishing community in the Tidewater of North Carolina, and a huge part of it was attending church. I sang in the choir, as I had sung in the choir back in my church in England. And by singing in the choir, I'd actually managed to find a way to be taken seriously by the other members of the church. I went to the men's Bible study, which happened an hour before the regular service. So I went to the men's Sunday school from 10 to 11, and then went in and sang in the choir from 11 to 12. So I had a very good avenue into understanding the religious traditions of the Southern Baptists. And I also talked to a lot of members of the congregation and so on and so forth. But it's all from the outside. It's all looking at, why do people believe these things which I don't believe? Why do they believe them? And I wrote a dissertation which was eventually published as a book, and so on and so forth. And that became part of my career. Well, then, in 1992, I got a fellowship to the School of American Research in Santa Fe, which is for a year, a residential fellowship for a year. And at the time, I had a 1-year-old son. And it was a great opportunity for me because the dances of the pueblos all around that part of New Mexico were the dances that I had written my master's thesis on. And so it was an enormous opportunity for me to do field work and to get deeper into the traditions of the Hispanic members of communities there, the Tiwa, Tewa, Towa, Querés, Puebloans. It was wonderful. And so in 1992, the whole family moved for a year to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Well, as it turns out, living in New Mexico was extraordinary. I had at my disposal enormous numbers of pueblos where they did a variety of dances. Pretty much every week, one of the pueblos would have a public dance. Sometimes it would be a Tiwa or Tewa ceremony, which was partially excluded from the public. Some of it was public, and some of the dances were of Spanish origin and they were more accessible to the public. And I could talk to the dancers, and I could, in some cases, photograph. Often went off and had lunch with them on the days of their festivals and so forth. It was really wonderful. And on top of that, there was a very serious Catholic element, both in the pueblos and in the cities, that was unlike anything that I had ever come across before. For example, on Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, people would walk from their homes to the Santuario in Chimayo, which is in central New Mexico. And some of them walked the better part of 30, 40, 50 miles. Walked, either on their own or in groups. And it was really just impressive in ways that I had not experienced before, either as an individual or as an anthropologist. Now, there's certainly something inspiring about driving the roads on Maundy Thursday morning and seeing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people walking through the desert to the Santuario in Chimayo. Now, Chimayo's Santuario also has in the basement a hole called an earth navel that was originally one of the earth navels of the Puebloan people. That's believed to be the place where humans came up from underground into the world. And it's supposedly healing dirt that you can gather, and some people drink it in water, and it never runs out. It continually replenishes itself. So there's that. There's the people, some of them with rosaries, some of them carrying crosses, hiking through the desert to this Santuario. It's all inspiring. And the desert itself is inspiring. I used to spend Sunday mornings going out in the desert with my son, and he just treated the desert as a giant sandbox, and I would sit and just contemplate the world on Sunday mornings. And there's obviously a deeply spiritual part of me being moved by the environment. And as it happens, around the end of my time in Santa Fe, I was put in touch with some Anglican theologians including the father of one of my friends at Oxford, who was a bishop in the Anglican Church, who had some rather unorthodox thoughts about the resurrection. There were some bishops in the 60s who'd had some unorthodox thoughts about God, inspiring what's called the God is dead debate. This other theologian had been questioning the nature of the resurrection, whether it was in some sense a real event. And I got to reading a lot of the newer theology, the liberal theology, and realizing, yeah, this is okay, because it doesn't require me to believe in these outlandish things like that the earth is 6,000 years old and that God brought it into being in 6 days and all of this kind of thing. I mean, it just made a lot more sense to me. And I decided that when I returned to New York to take up my professorship again, that I would seek ordination. Because what I would like to do is to find a way to show people the nature of spirituality, which I had seen in the desert, both among Puebloan people and also among Hispano people in and around Santa Fe and the desert itself. I had been inspired, and I thought I would like to try to bring this inspiration to others. And my journey got even more complicated at that point. But that's my starting point, or let me say that. So there are two real starting points, if you like. One was a starting point that fizzled out, and one was a starting point that I didn't think was going to be one, and which proved to be inspiring. So the first one was going to Oxford and being disillusioned with academic theology, and the second was studying anthropology and studying religion and becoming captivated by the actual beliefs of people in their daily lives, and particularly in New Mexico, where everything breathed spiritual life. So much of life in New Mexico, in the pueblos in one way, and in just regular villages in other ways, everything had a spiritual quality to it. There were traditional plays that they enacted at certain times of the year. At Easter, before Good Friday, there were men's societies that had these ceremonies called tenebrae, where slowly candles are extinguished in a small room until eventually it's completely dark, to signify the darkness of the death of Jesus. And then people on the roofs start banging chains and making a lot of noise to signify the opening of hell at the death of Jesus. The pilgrimages to Chimayo on Maundy Thursday, and on and on and on. There are just so many ways in which they had invigorated their lives with spiritual activity, which seemed so alien to the world of New York, which is just materialist and matter of fact. Let's make money, let's do this, how do I go about making sure I have this fixed, and so on. And no sense of transcendence, of spirituality, all just very plain and straightforward. And it just made me feel like, no, I want to bring that spiritual, transcendent world back to New York. And And it turned out to be a lot more difficult than I thought, because nobody wanted me at first. And so let me talk about that part of the journey when I got back to New York and I decided, okay, I want to be ordained. Who will have me? And everyone basically saying, I don't know. So it was an interesting process. And meanwhile, before I get to that, tell your friends about this video series. Please like, please subscribe, and I will continue talking about my journey to ordination on Friday. Have a good week.